Love rarely announces its arrival with clarity. It does not knock at the door of consciousness and wait to be acknowledged. Instead, it seeps quietly into the unnoticed spaces of the mind, settling itself in glances that linger a second too long, in conversations that feel heavier than their words, in a strange sense of familiarity that cannot be explained. Long before it is spoken, it is already there, shaping perception, altering attention, bending the ordinary into something charged with meaning. At first, it disguises itself as curiosity. A person becomes interesting, then unusually memorable, then somehow significant without justification. The mind attempts to rationalize this shift, searching for concrete reasons, shared interests, pleasant demeanor, coincidence. But these explanations feel insufficient, as though they are only fragments attempting to describe something far more complex. What is actually unfolding exists beneath the level of conscious articulation, in a place where emotion precedes language. Silence becomes its natural habitat, not an empty silence, but one filled with unexpressed recognition. The individual experiencing it may not yet call it love, yet their behavior begins to reorganize around its presence. They notice details they would otherwise ignore. They remember words, gestures, expressions with unusual clarity. Their inner world starts to orbit around someone who has not even been informed of their importance. This unspoken state is not passive. It is active in ways that are difficult to detect. It influences choices, shifts priorities, and quietly reshapes identity. The person begins to encounter parts of themselves that were previously dormant: tenderness, attentiveness, even vulnerability. These qualities emerge not because they are deliberately cultivated, but because the presence of the other person evokes them naturally. There is also a tension within this silence. On one hand, there is a pull toward expression, a desire to bring what is felt into the open, to give it form through words. On the other hand, there is resistance. To speak is to define, and to define is to risk. As long as love remains unspoken, it exists in a protected state, untouched by rejection or misunderstanding. It can grow freely in imagination, unconstrained by reality. The longer it remains unspoken, the more it deepens. It moves beyond surface attraction and begins to root itself in something more essential. The person is no longer simply admired. They become meaningful in a way that feels almost inevitable. Their presence carries psychological weight, as if it resonates with something fundamental within the self. In this way, love does not begin at the moment of confession. The confession is merely the surface emergence of something that has been forming, quietly and persistently, beneath awareness. By the time it is spoken, it has already lived through countless silent moments, internal dialogues, and unexpressed recognitions that have shaped it into what it is. The fear of vulnerability does not appear as something obvious or easily identifiable. It often disguises itself as hesitation, as rational thought, as a careful weighing of consequences. A person may believe they are simply being cautious, protecting themselves from potential discomfort, when in reality they are standing at the edge of something deeply meaningful and retreating from it. This fear is not born from weakness, but from an acute awareness of what is at stake when one chooses to reveal something genuine. To be vulnerable is to allow another person access to parts of the self that are usually guarded. These are not superficial aspects, but those tied to identity, worth, and emotional truth. When someone feels deeply, they are not just risking rejection of their words, they are risking the invalidation of something that feels integral to who they are. This transforms a simple confession into something far more significant, something that carries psychological weight. The mind, in its effort to maintain stability, begins to construct defenses. It questions the timing, the appropriateness, the likelihood of reciprocation. It suggests waiting for a better moment, for clearer signs, for certainty that rarely comes. These thoughts create a sense of control, but they also serve to delay action indefinitely. What is truly happening is not careful planning, but avoidance dressed in logic. There is also the memory of past experiences that contributes to this hesitation. Previous moments of rejection, misunderstanding, or emotional exposure leave traces that shape future behavior. Even if they are not consciously recalled, they influence the present. The individual becomes more guarded, more selective, more inclined to keep their inner world concealed. Vulnerability begins to feel less like a natural state and more like a risk that must be managed. At the same time, the feeling itself does not disappear. It persists, often growing stronger in the absence of expression. This creates a tension between what is felt and what is allowed to be shown. The person may find themselves caught in an internal conflict, where one part seeks connection while another insists on protection. This division can lead to inaction, where nothing is said, and yet everything is felt. What makes this fear particularly powerful is its subtlety. It rarely declares itself openly as fear. Instead, it operates through doubt, through delay, through the constant search for reasons not to act. It convinces the individual that silence is safer, that withholding is wiser, that the unknown consequences of honesty are too great to face. And yet, the longer vulnerability is avoided, the more significant it becomes. What could have been a simple expression turns into something heavy with anticipation and anxiety. The moment of truth, postponed repeatedly, begins to carry the weight of all the moments that were missed. The fear does not diminish with time, it evolves, becoming more intricate, more convincing, more difficult to confront. Hidden emotions do not remain inactive simply because they are unseen. They operate beneath the surface of awareness, shaping behavior in ways that often escape conscious recognition. A person may believe they are acting freely, making choices based on logic or habit, while in reality their actions are being subtly guided by feelings they have not fully acknowledged. These concealed forces influence tone, timing, attention, and even the direction of one's life without ever declaring themselves openly. There is a peculiar intelligence to hidden emotions. They do not demand immediate recognition. Instead, they embed themselves into patterns. A person begins to gravitate towards certain individuals, situations, or environments without fully understanding why. They may find themselves investing energy where it is not obviously required, or withdrawing from moments that seem harmless on the surface. These movements are not random. They are expressions of something deeper, something that has not yet been brought into conscious awareness. In relationships, this dynamic becomes especially visible. A person might linger in conversations longer than necessary, offer help without being asked, or experience a subtle shift in mood based on another's presence. None of these actions need to be explained outwardly, and often they are not even explained inwardly. Yet they form a consistent pattern, revealing an underlying emotional reality that remains unspoken. The individual may interpret these behaviors as kindness, coincidence, or habit, without realizing that they are manifestations of a deeper attachment. Hidden emotions also influence perception. They act as a filter through which reality is interpreted. The same gesture, the same words, the same silence can take on entirely different meanings depending on what is felt beneath the surface. A simple smile may be remembered with unusual clarity, while a neutral expression might be overanalyzed. This selective attention is not deliberate. It is guided by the emotional significance assigned unconsciously. There is also a tendency for hidden emotions to seek indirect expression. When something cannot be spoken, it finds other ways to appear. It may surface in subtle body language, in the rhythm of speech, in the way attention is given or withheld. Even avoidance can be a form of expression where distance itself communicates what words do not. These indirect signals often reveal more than direct statements, because they are less controlled and more closely tied to genuine feeling. At times, the individual becomes aware of inconsistencies in their own behavior. They may question why they feel drawn in one moment and distant in another, why their reactions seem disproportionate to the situation. This confusion arises from the gap between conscious intention and unconscious influence. The mind seeks coherence, but hidden emotions operate outside its immediate control. As these emotions persist, they begin to organize behavior more firmly. What started as subtle inclinations can evolve into stable patterns, shaping decisions in ways that feel natural but are deeply rooted in what has been left unexamined. The longer they remain hidden, the more influence they exert, quietly directing actions while remaining just beyond the reach of clear understanding. A confession is often mistaken for a sudden event, as though it emerges fully formed in a single moment of courage. In reality, it is the visible culmination of a long and often unnoticed inner process. What appears as a brief statement carries within it a history of internal dialogue, hesitation, resistance, and gradual alignment. It is not the beginning of something new, but the resolution of something that has been unfolding beneath awareness for some time. Within the psyche, opposing forces tend to develop when a significant emotion is left unexpressed. On one side, there is the authentic feeling, persistent and quietly insistent. On the other, there is the structure of defense, composed of doubt, caution, and the desire to maintain equilibrium. These forces do not simply cancel each other out, they coexist, creating a tension that shapes thought and behavior. The individual may move back and forth between moments of clarity and moments of retreat, never fully committing to either. This internal division cannot sustain itself indefinitely. The human mind is oriented toward coherence, toward a sense of unity between what is felt and what is acknowledged. When this alignment is absent, a subtle form of discomfort emerges. It may not be dramatic, but it is persistent. It appears in restlessness, in recurring thoughts, in the inability to fully disengage from the source of the emotion. The psyche continues to circle the same point, attempting to reconcile what is known internally with what remains unspoken externally. Over time, this tension begins to demand resolution. The defenses that once felt protective start to feel restrictive. The effort required to maintain silence becomes greater than the effort required to speak. What was once avoided now becomes necessary, not because the external situation has changed, but because the internal state has reached a point where concealment is no longer sustainable. The act of confession, then, represents more than communication. It is a reorganization of the self. By articulating what has been hidden, the individual brings previously separated parts of their psyche into alignment. The feeling is no longer isolated in the unconscious, influencing behavior indirectly. It is acknowledged, given form, and integrated into conscious awareness. This integration has a distinct psychological effect. It reduces the internal conflict that has been present, allowing for a greater sense of clarity and stability. The individual no longer needs to navigate the constant tension between expression and suppression. Instead, there is a directness that replaces ambiguity, a coherence that replaces fragmentation. However, this process does not eliminate uncertainty. The external response remains unknown, and with it comes the possibility of rejection or misunderstanding. Yet the significance of the confession lies not in controlling the outcome, but in resolving the internal division. It is a movement towards psychological wholeness, where what is felt and what is expressed are no longer in opposition, but exist within the same conscious framework. To reveal love is often interpreted as a simple emotional risk, a matter of whether one will be accepted or rejected by another. Yet the deeper reality is far more complex. What is placed at stake is not merely the possibility of refusal, but the structure of the self that has been carefully maintained up to that point. Love, when it is genuine, does not remain confined to feeling alone. It reorganizes perception, priority, and identity. To speak it aloud is to expose these internal shifts to the scrutiny of reality. Before it is expressed, love exists in a contained space where it can be shaped without resistance. It becomes part of an internal narrative, one that allows the individual to explore meaning, connection, and possibility without interference. Within this private domain, the feeling can expand freely, often idealized, protected from contradiction. The self adapts around it quietly, integrating the presence of the other person into its inner world without disruption. The moment of revelation alters this condition entirely. What was internal becomes external, subject to response, interpretation, and consequence. The individual is no longer in control of the narrative. Their feeling, once contained and defined solely by their own perception, now enters a shared reality where it can be affirmed, altered, or denied. This shift introduces a profound sense of exposure, not only emotionally, but psychologically. At the core of this exposure lies identity. When someone loves deeply, they often align aspects of who they are with that feeling. Their sense of meaning, their understanding of themselves, becomes intertwined with the existence of that connection. To confess is to risk the destabilization of this alignment. If the feeling is not returned, the individual is confronted not just with rejection, but with the need to reassess parts of their own identity that were formed around the expectation of connection. This is why the fear surrounding confession can feel disproportionate to the situation. It is not simply about hearing no. It is about what that no implies internally. It challenges assumptions, disrupts imagined futures, and forces a reconfiguration of the emotional landscape that had been constructed in silence. The individual must then separate what is essential to themselves from what was projected onto the relationship. At the same time, the act of revealing love carries a transformative potential. By bringing the feeling into reality, the individual confronts the limits of imagination and the unpredictability of another person's autonomy. This confrontation can lead to growth, as it requires the self to become more defined, more resilient, less dependent on untested assumptions. To risk identity in this way is not an act of recklessness, but of depth. It reflects a willingness to allow one's internal world to be influenced by truth, rather than preserved through illusion. The individual steps beyond the safety of what is imagined and into the instability of what is real, where the self can no longer remain unchanged. When someone reveals a truth they have carried for a long time, the moment is often misunderstood as a simple exchange of emotion. It is interpreted as a confession to be accepted or declined, as though its significance lies only in the outcome. Yet what is being offered is not merely a statement of feeling, but a condensed form of experience, time, reflection, hesitation, and inner conflict brought into a single, vulnerable expression. To receive it without awareness is to overlook the depth from which it emerged. The individual who speaks has already undergone a process that is largely invisible. They have confronted uncertainty, navigated doubt, and wrestled with the consequences of both action and silence. By the time they choose to reveal what they feel, they are not simply presenting an emotion in its raw state. They are presenting something that has been examined, resisted, and ultimately accepted within themselves. This gives their words a weight that cannot be measured by their simplicity. For the one who receives this truth, the challenge is not to produce an immediate answer, but to recognize what is being placed before them. It is an invitation into another person's inner world, one that has remained closed until this moment. To respond carelessly or without consideration is to treat something significant as though it were ordinary. Awareness in this context becomes a form of respect, a recognition that what is being shared carries meaning beyond its surface form. There is also a natural impulse to evaluate the confession in terms of personal feeling. The mind moves quickly to determine whether the sentiment is reciprocated, whether it aligns with one's own desires or expectations. While this reaction is inevitable, it can overshadow the importance of the act itself. The revelation deserves to be acknowledged independently of the response it will receive, because its value lies in the courage required to bring it into the open. To meet such a moment with awareness is to pause before reacting, to allow space for understanding. It involves recognizing the vulnerability that has been exposed and the trust implied in that exposure. Even if the feeling is not shared, the act of revealing it establishes a connection that is real, however brief or asymmetrical it may be. This connection is not defined by mutuality, but by the authenticity of what has been expressed. Respect, in this sense, is not agreement or acceptance, but attentiveness. It is the willingness to see the other person clearly in that moment, without reducing their experience to something convenient or easily dismissed. It requires a certain discipline, a resistance to the urge to simplify or deflect. The response becomes not just a reflection of one's feelings, but of one's capacity to engage with another person's reality in a thoughtful and grounded way. The way such a truth is received can shape how it is remembered, not only by the one who spoke, but also by the one who listened. It becomes part of a shared history, carrying with it the tone, the awareness, and the level of care that was present in that exchange.